National Women's Law Center, and I want to thank you for joining this webinar today. We will be taking questions after our featured experts have finished their portions of the presentation, but we encourage you to submit questions as they come up throughout the webinar. And you can submit a question by typing it in the designated area on your control panel and hitting send. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer all questions in the time we have, but we will do our best to answer as many as we can. Also note that this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording of the presentation, as well as a link to the PowerPoint slides in the next few days. So I'd like to thank Keri Moran-Kuhn at the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence for coordinating this webinar with us, and now I turn it over to her.
Hi, this is Keri Moran-Kuhn of the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Here at the Coalition, we are very pleased to be able to bring and support this webinar for advocates here in Oregon, and we really thank all the presenters today, and especially the National Women's Law Center for enabling us to have this great webinar today. And we will be making sure that the webinar is posted out to other advocates around the state as well, since it will be recorded. Thanks. And I think
great, and now we will get started with Amy Matsui from the National Women's Law Center.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks so much. We're delighted to be participating on this webinar, and happy to be talking to all of the advocates who will be listening to the presentation in Oregon, and just to be part of your efforts to help survivors, particularly with tax issues that they may be facing. So on today's webinar, as you saw in the previous slide, we have a number of presenters. I'm happy to be joined by my colleagues from the National Women's Law Center, and also Nicole Appleberry, who is the director of the Low-Income Taxpayer Clinic at the University of Michigan Law School and has a long background in representing domestic violence survivors, and also, as you can imagine, a deep and broad expertise in tax issues. Susanna Birdsong is my colleague, a law fellow at the National Women's Law Center, and works on tax issues here as well. And as the slide mentioned, I'm senior counsel at the National Women's Law Center and work on tax issues for women and their families. Next slide, please. So today we're going to cover a number of topics related to tax issues that domestic violence survivors may face, and that you can help guide them through, or at least help them ask the right questions with regard to filing their taxes. So the topics that we're going to cover specifically range from when survivors need to file a tax return, some filing status issues. We're going to talk about some federal and state tax credits for which survivors may be eligible, particularly if they have children. We're going to talk about free tax preparation assistance, tax rights that everyone has, and then we're going to talk about dealing with the IRS, particularly when there are issues or controversies with regard to not being able to pay tax debts. And we're going to also have a discussion about some exceptions to tax liabilities that can arise from married filing jointly returns, and some special circumstances that apply to survivors of domestic violence. And we also will have some resources and some Oregon-specific ones among those for advocates who are assisting survivors. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kick us off with a very basic question. There are going to be a whole host of issues that survivors are considering. They have to think about their safety, they have to think about their family, and they have to think about their economic security. And so in all of those, one question that survivors may just have to step back and think about is when they need to file a tax return. So I wanted to talk about a couple of considerations that survivors should think through. So first is if survivors have a certain level of income. This can be their wages, salary, other income, and if they're married, it may also include the income of a spouse. Once their income hits a particular level, depending on their filing status, they need to file a federal tax return. In addition, even if they don't hit that income threshold, survivors may want to file tax returns in order to receive tax benefits. If they're eligible for tax credits, or if they've overpaid their taxes while they're working and it's more than they would owe based on their income, they may be able to get a refund by filing a tax return. And then finally, the last circumstance that I wanted to touch on for when survivors may want to file a tax return is to kind of establish their separate tax existence or identity. They may not have had bank accounts or credit cards. They may not have been the person in charge of their finances or had a lot of financial resources in their own name. And filing a federal tax return may be one step in kind of putting together an economic identity for them to stand alone. And in particular, if the spouse or the ex is planning or they suspect they may file a joint tax return, then the survivor should file a tax return as soon as they can. Next slide, please. So a couple of choices for survivors. There are different filing statuses on the federal level, and for the most part, these are similar to the state level. They can file as single, married filing jointly, which means that they will have joint tax liability with the spouse. All of the tax responsibilities and liabilities from the particular tax return are both attached to the survivor and her spouse. The alternative for married survivors is married filing separately, which, as the name might imply, means that there are separate liabilities. They're not together. Another possibility is to file as head of household, which means that the survivor qualifies as unmarried, either because she is divorced or legally separated, or because she has been living apart from the spouse for the last 6 months of the year and provides half of the household income or the resources to provide for half of the household. And this is for survivors who have dependent children. And the last status is qualifying widower with a dependent child. So just to note that the marital status is determined on the last day of the taxable year, December 31st, 2013, for the 2013 tax year, unless the spouse died during the year. Next slide, please. So this is just to go over in a little bit more detail what the difference is between the different filing status options for married survivors. And it is just to bring home the point that married filing jointly is not the only option. So again, for married filing separately, it separates the tax liabilities between the spouses. There are less favorable tax rates for married filing separately, and also married filing separately, tax filers cannot claim the federal EITC or the child and dependent care tax credit, although they can file for the child tax credit for a dependent child. As I mentioned, if the survivor is legally separated, he or she can file as single or as head of household if the spouse did not live with the survivor for the last 6 months of the year, if the survivor pays half the cost of maintaining the household, and the dependent child lives with the survivor for over half of the year, then the survivor can file as head of household. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons that I mentioned that survivors may want to file a tax return is that may make them eligible to receive a tax refund. And as we're going to discuss, these refunds can be worth, especially for survivors with children, up to thousands of dollars. And that can be a way not only to establish kind of your own separate tax or economic existence, but also have a tax refund can help the survivor get on her feet in terms of needing cash for living expenses, to set aside some savings, or for other expenses. However, there are some concerns that survivors may have about receiving tax refunds. First, they may be worried that their mail is not safe, that if the tax refund is mailed to them in a paper check, that there may be concerns around that. So and Keri can speak to this more specifically, but state agencies or the coalition may offer an address confidentiality program, which provides survivors with a safe address. Your program may provide an address, or alternatively, if the survivor has or can establish a bank account, she may be able to have the refund directly deposited, and then that takes a paper check out of consideration. Unfortunately, it's sometimes the case that survivors may not have been able to establish their own financial existence in the form of a bank account. So some EITC coalitions can actually help survivors open bank accounts either at banks or at credit unions. Some VITA sites also have options for prepaid debit cards, although you and the survivors that you represent should be alert to user fees to make sure that those aren't too high. And then obviously, if the debit card is lost or stolen with the refund on it, there's little recourse for the survivor. So that's just one downside that applies if there's a prepaid debit card. Next slide, please. Thanks, Amy. The next topic that I wanted to cover is that there are federal and state tax credits that may help survivors get back on their feet, or at least provide a little economic security during a very stressful time. So domestic violence survivors should know about certain federal and state tax credits. The federal Earned Income Tax Credit and the Oregon version, the Oregon EITC, the federal Child Tax Credit, and then some tax credits that are for child and dependent care. There's the federal credit, there's an Oregon Child and Dependent Care Credit, and finally there's a tax credit called the Oregon Working Family Tax Credit. Tax filers can receive all of these tax credits if they're eligible, and we're going to go into a little bit more detail about them in the next slides. These tax credits, together or separately, can be worth a lot. So for example, filing her 2013 taxes, an unmarried woman who is working, if she has 3 children and child care expenses earning $38,000 in 2013, could receive up to $6,000 from the federal EITC and up to $363 from the Oregon EITC. She could get up to $3,000 from the federal child tax credit, and in addition, she could get up to $2,100 from the federal child and dependent care tax credit, up to $1,800 from the Oregon Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, and up to 40% of qualifying child care expenses without limit from the Working Family Child Care Tax Credit. Some of these credits are refundable, meaning that if the survivor doesn't have any tax liability, not only does she not have to pay out to the IRS or the State Department of Revenue, but she may be able to get a refund back if she qualifies for some of these credits. Among the refundable credits are the federal EITC and the Oregon EITC. In addition, the federal child tax credit has a refundable portion. And finally, the Oregon Working Family Tax Credit, which is for child care expenses, is also a refundable credit. Unfortunately, the federal and Oregon versions of the child and dependent care tax credits are not refundable. So as you know, and as I alluded to, refunds can help survivors save by creating an emergency fund, building up savings, as well as paying for current expenses. As I mentioned, the refund can be deposited into a bank account, or in addition, if direct deposit is used for filing federal taxes, in particular, some of the refund, if there is one, can be put into a savings bond. And then finally, as I mentioned, many EITC coalitions can help open bank accounts or do other financial education or asset building activities for survivors built around the refund and the tax filing season. Next slide, please. I do want to have a note of caution that tax refunds can be withheld, however. So if a survivor owes taxes from previous years, whether it's the spouse's or ex-spouse's tax debt, unless the filer qualifies as an injured spouse or an innocent spouse, the two exceptions that Nicole is going to discuss later in the presentation, tax refunds can be withheld for back taxes that are owed. In addition, if a survivor owes child support or if a survivor is in default on a student loan, the tax refund or portion of it can also be withheld. So at this point, I'm just going to very quickly give a little bit more detail about some of the tax credits that we mentioned. And the first that I'm going to start with is the federal EITC, or Earned Income Tax Credit. This tax credit is a wage supplement for low and moderate income workers. Next slide, please. So just to run over quickly the values and how much at its maximum the EITC can be worth. So in 2013, the EITC can be worth up to $6,000 for a survivor with 3 or more children, up to almost $5,400 for a survivor with 2 children, and up to $3,200 for a survivor with 1 child. In addition, the EITC is also available for individuals who do not have children, and the maximum for those individuals is $487, and married couples can also apply for this as well. I should note for the EITC that there are income limits. So as the tax filer's income increases, the EITC after a certain level will decrease, and there are cutoffs. So for the survivor with 3 or more children, can't earn more than $46,227 or $51,567 if married filing jointly, and still qualify for the Earned Income Tax Credit. The income limits are a little bit different for different numbers of children, and for survivors without children, the income limits are pretty low. It's $14,340 for a single filer, and just over $19,600 for married filing jointly. Next slide, please. So in order to claim the EITC, the survivor must have some earned income so that the survivor could receive unemployment insurance or other benefits, but needs to have at least some earnings, although this can include combat pay for people who are enlisted. In addition, the survivor must be a citizen or legal resident or married to one, and the survivor must have a valid Social Security number, as we'll talk on the next slide, the children. So in order to claim a child for the EITC, the child has to be related to the survivor in a particular way, or adopted, or a foster child. In addition, there's something called a residency requirement, under which the child has to live with a survivor for over half the year. And then finally, children have to be under a certain age. They have to be under age 19, or if they're a full-time student, under age 24. However, if the child is disabled, there is no age limit. Next slide. So based on the federal EITC, we have the Oregon EITC. It's a percentage of the federal credit, and it's also refundable. So if you qualify for the federal, you will then be eligible to claim the Oregon EITC as well. So the next tax credit that I want to briefly touch on is the child tax credit, which is intended to help with just the general costs of raising children. Next slide. The child tax credit is worth up to $1,000 per child, no matter how many children a survivor has. So a single mom with 2 children who earned $8,500 in 2013 can claim a $2,000 child tax credit. So just as with the EITC, the amount of the credit decreases as the survivor's income rises up to the cutoff limit. And if a survivor doesn't owe enough taxes to use the whole credit up, she may be eligible for a refund. Next slide. So similar to the EITC, there are certain requirements for claiming children for the child tax credit. For the child tax credit, unlike the EITC, the age limit is 17 and the child must be claimed as a dependent. However, the relationship and residency requirements are the same as for the EITC. In addition, the child has to either be a U.S. citizen, a U.S. national, or a resident alien. Next slide. As I mentioned, the CTC, the Child Tax Credit, provides a refund for people who don't have enough tax liability and whose income is sufficiently low. Then this refund is calculated for survivors either as 15% of income above $3,000. That's the minimum amount that the survivor has to earn in order to qualify for a refund, or the amount of the child tax credit over and above tax liability, whichever of those two options is less. So for example, let's take the case of Jane, who has 2 kids and earned $8,500 and has no income tax liability. Using these formulas, she'll receive a refund of $825 from the child tax credit. Next slide. So unfortunately, there's no Oregon version of the child tax credit, but there are for the last tax credit that we're going to talk about. So the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit is a federal tax credit to help meet the costs of child care for dependent children under age 13, or for care for disabled dependents or spouses who live with the survivor. For child care, any kind of paid child care, which could include before and after school care, summer day camp, child care that's in a child care center or a family daycare home with a neighbor or certain relatives, any kind of child care that's paid in any of those categories can be claimed for the credit. But the care has to be related to employment. So the survivor needs to use the child care in order to either work or look for work. Next slide. The way that the federal child and dependent care credit is calculated is based on a percentage of a certain amount of expenses, child care or dependent care expenses that can be claimed. So for example, if Maria has $15,000 in income and she paid $1,500 in child care expenses in 2013, she could be eligible for a child and dependent care tax credit worth $525. Overall, the credit's worth a maximum of $2,100 for 2 children or dependents and $1,050 for 1 child or dependent. Unfortunately, this federal tax credit is not refundable, but it can reduce the tax liability that the survivor has, and that will increase the refund from other credits. Next slide. So just as the Oregon EITC is based on the federal credit and is a percentage of it, the Oregon Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit is based on the federal tax credit. It's worth up to $1,800, and the value of the credit similarly decreases as income goes up. And in Oregon, for the Oregon Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, tax filers earning more than $45,000 can't claim it at all. So this credit, unfortunately, is also non-refundable, but the credit can be carried forward to wipe away tax liability for up to 5 years. Next slide. And finally, that brings us to the Oregon Working Family Tax Credit. So this is also a tax credit that is to meet child and dependent care expenses. It's worth up to, at its maximum, 40% of child care expenses. Unlike the federal child and dependent care tax credit, there's not a limit on how many expenses that you can claim, so it's just 40% of the total. And it's available to families earning not more than 250% of the federal poverty level. And this credit is refundable. Next slide. So one question that you may have, thinking about your survivors and all of the different needs that they have, is whether refunds from the federal tax credits would affect her eligibility for other federal benefits and for the means tests in those. And the answer to that, fortunately, is no. So if there is a refund received by the survivor, it won't count as income to determine whether or not the survivor is eligible for any federally funded public benefit program like TANF or SNAP or SSI. In addition, any savings from refund will be excluded for 12 months following the receipt of the refund. So it's not something which should mess the survivor up if they use the refund within 12 months. Next slide, please. And I'm going to end just by giving you this handy-dandy cheat sheet. So it goes over the different credits that we talked about, briefly mentions what a family needs in order to be eligible, lists the age of the qualifying children because it's different for every credit, and it also puts out information about the maximum credit value. So hopefully this is something that can just be a quick reminder for the different kinds of credits that can be eligible for families. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Susanna, to my colleague from the National Women's Law Center, because she's going to talk about a new tax credit which is available for 2014. Susanna?
Great, thanks, Amy. So I just wanted to highlight in a few slides here for you all the premium tax credit, which is the new tax credit that is available to help people afford health insurance through Obamacare. So open enrollment through the health exchanges runs through March 31st, which is only a couple of weeks away. So if you know of folks who were thinking about enrolling but haven't yet, really encourage them to do that in the next couple of weeks. Although I just wanted to note here for you too that there is a special enrollment period at any point throughout the year for people who are facing special circumstances like the birth of a child or marriage or divorce or a job loss that would change their income limit and perhaps make them eligible for the credit when they weren't before. So if you or someone you know is potentially eligible for these tax credits, you should visit healthcare.gov or call 1-800-318-2596 today to get started on your application. And just a few details about the premium tax credit, so you have a little information about how it works. Unlike most tax credits that are only available when you file your taxes every year, the premium tax credit is available as soon as you sign up and start paying for insurance. So it's a credit that is paid on a monthly basis, and it goes directly to the health insurance provider. And the amount of the credit is based on both your family size and your income. And it's available to folks up to 400% of the federal poverty line, which for a family of 4 is around $94,000. And then this last point on this slide is really important. So you will be required when you file your taxes next year to settle up. Because this is a tax credit that you receive throughout the year, you'll settle up, and if there are any changes in your income or household size, the amount of the credit that you receive throughout the year could be different from the amount of the credit that you are actually due. So if there are changes in family size or income throughout the year that you're receiving the tax credit, it's really important to report those changes to the healthcare exchange so that you don't end up owing any money back at tax time. And this is just an example here so you can see how this works in practice for Maria and her 5-year-old twins. They have a household income of just under $26,000, and that puts them right at 133% of the federal poverty line. So at this income, Maria is going to contribute a total of no more than 3% of her annual income, or around $780 a year, toward her family's health insurance premium. The total actual annual premium cost is over $7,000, so the premium tax credit is going to come in and make up the difference there between that $7,000 and her contribution of $779. So every month, the health insurance provider that Maria selects will be paid $520 premium tax credit, and Maria will be responsible for making up the difference and paying the health insurer the difference of $65 a month. So the premium tax credit goes a long way to help folks afford health insurance through the health insurance exchanges. And then just a few notes here on how to claim all of these tax benefits that Amy covered and the premium tax credit as well. Survivors must file both federal and state tax returns to be eligible for the tax credits that have been covered so far. And there's a separate form for each tax credit. And they may also be able to file or correct returns for tax years prior to this one, if that meets their situation. And then also just a few notes on the tax preparation assistance that's available. On the next slide, there are several points about different places that you can go to get free tax help if you're under a certain income limit. Generally, if you have a household income below $48,000, you're eligible for free tax prep help at a VITA site. And this cashoregon.org website lists the VITA sites that are nearest you. And then the IRS also coordinates with the AARP to offer tax help to people over the age of 60. And so the second bullet point just lists the website that you can go to receive more information about the AARP site nearest to you. And if there isn't a VITA site near you, it's great that there's this local contact information for folks in Oregon. So you can contact Maggie or Angela at the numbers listed there to think about creating a VITA site in your community so that folks who qualify can receive that free tax prep help. And then lastly, individuals with incomes below $57,000 a year can use the Free File program. This is an IRS partnership with a lot of the big name online tax preparers. So people can file their taxes online and not pay anything to do so if they meet the income qualifications. And then just a note on volunteer versus paid tax prep. So on the previous slide, we covered all of the volunteer tax preparation assistance that might be available. And it's important to let people know about those resources because often people are visiting paid tax preparers that close up shop after tax season. So if you have questions about your return, they may not be available to help you answer them. And then sometimes they also charge these refund anticipation loans or fees, and the volunteer sites don't charge anything. So they can be a great resource for low-income families who need the help. And also important for survivors that free tax prep facilities and people doing that work can also connect families with other services and resources in the community that would be beneficial to them. And I think at this point, Nicole is going to take over and talk about LITC work.
Okay, hi everybody. So yeah, LITC work. I'm from a low-income taxpayer clinic. We are part of a network of clinics. I'm not sure the exact number, but there are 170-ish nationwide. And we are available, but so I'm going to get into that a little bit more in detail later. But for the beginning, we're going to just talk about some basic tax issues that may apply to you or your clients. So first off, everyone has tax rights. So there are some commonly misunderstood things here. One is you officially have a right to see and understand your entire return, including with supporting documents, before signing a joint return. So that applies whether it's your batter who has maybe prepared the return, or of course any tax preparer. There is an issue sometimes with preparers now who are doing one version with the client in the office and then altering the return and sending it in to the IRS differently. So everybody should be asking to see the entire return and get a copy of the entire document as it was filed. People also have a right to refuse to sign a joint return, and married people do not have to file jointly. A lot of people think that they do, and you absolutely do not. You have that option to file married filing separately, or perhaps even head of household, depending. You also have the right to request an automatic 4-month extension of time to file, and this is just a form you file. It has to be filed by April 15th, but if that is filed by April 15th, there's no question you have an additional 4 months to file your return. So if somebody's life is chaotic in April, they're trying to really focus on staying safe, then they should at least file. It's a very simple form, at least file that form to give themselves more time. Now, that is not an extension of time to pay anything due on the return. So if there was something due on the return and it is not paid until later, there will be some interest. But the rates are actually pretty low right now at about 3%, and maybe it's worth it. Or you can, of course, send in a check toward your taxes to minimize or eliminate the interest. And, of course, you have the right to get copies of prior year returns from the IRS, as well as other information. You can ask about how long they have to collect, their statute of limitations for that. You can ask to see all kinds of information. All right, next slide. So often what happens is people get letters from the IRS and they freak out. They don't want to, they may not even open the letter. That is very common. Or if they do open the letter, they have no idea what it says because it's kind of written in tax/legalese. But these are kind of the 3 main kinds of letters you might get from the IRS. And one is if they just think that the survivor and or her spouse or former spouse should have filed a tax return. So they haven't gotten a return and they have some indication that maybe a return is appropriate, and so they're just checking into it. Another version is if they think that somebody owes taxes, and so they're trying to collect or trying to at least make some kind of arrangement with the person. And then there's a third kind when they actually just want more information about something that was put onto a tax return. So this is actually officially an audit, and they may be asking for more information. Often just a what we call a correspondence audit. They may just be asking for, hey, can you send us documentation about X, Y, or Z? And then if you're actually able to provide that documentation, it is likely, the problem is likely to go away. Now, unfortunately, what happens is that it's overwhelming and confusing to people, so they don't send in anything, or they have something, but they don't have exactly what the IRS asked for, and don't know that perhaps they can get away with an alternate document. That is a time too when somebody can contact an LITC for help, even just understanding these notices and figuring out what their options are. So next slide. Oh, but the big thing on that one too is it's better to do something. People get stressed out and do nothing, and that tends to end up in them losing either rights or money. So better to deal with it than to not deal with it. All right, so low-income taxpayer clinics can help. We are grant funded, so there are some requirements. For example, our clients, most of our clients need to earn no more than 250% of the poverty guidelines. There's another one that's not on the slide as well, that there can't be more than $50,000 per tax year in controversy, and that is including penalties but no interest. But basically, you can think of 2 different categories of issues that your clients may be having, and we can help with either of those. And one of those is when the IRS thinks that the survivor owes more money than what the survivor thinks they owe, or if the IRS is trying to collect and the survivor can't pay any or all of what is owed. So basically, one kind of issue if you're arguing about whether or not a liability is correct or an assessed liability is correct, and the other is just helping figure out what to do when you don't have enough money to pay with the IRS what you owe the IRS. So next slide. There's actually also the Taxpayer Advocate Service. So this is also under the auspices of the National Taxpayer Advocate. And so they have offices in every single state, and they are an internal ombudsman, basically. So they are internal to the IRS, but the National Taxpayer Advocate reports directly to Congress, and she is paying attention to what is going wrong in the tax system and what might be recommended to do about it. So she has in each state a TAS office, and they can act to help people when any of these things happen. So there's an economic harm or an immediate, or they're about to suffer economic harm. There is an unreasonable delay at the IRS when they've tried to resolve something, or simply if there's some kind of IRS system or procedure that either hasn't worked or somehow didn't resolve a problem. And of course, if there's any way that the tax laws are unfair or will impair the survivor's rights. So you can use TAS when basically there's something, I think of it as when there's something that needs to be unstuck and really you've got to have an internal person figure that out. And the low-income taxpayer clinics, when you need actual representation to fight the IRS about whether or not an assessment is correct or to help negotiate some kind of alternative to them just levying a bank account. Okay, next slide. Okay, so first off, there are different kinds of assessments, and some are for amounts due, kind of the base amount of a liability. There may also be penalties, and there may also be interest. So the big kind of common penalties are for failure to file, so failure to file on time, either by 4/15 or 4 months later if you've gotten an extension, and failure to pay when you've not paid on time. So there are penalties for that. They accrue fairly quickly, but there are times when it is appropriate, and the Internal Revenue Code recognizes that there are times when it is appropriate to waive those penalties. Unfortunately, the interest really can't be waived. There's a very, very, very short list of times when you can waive the interest. That applies to nearly no situation. But for failure to file or pay, the penalties, that is a facts and circumstance test. And while generally speaking, ignorance of the law, mistakes, forgetfulness by themselves are not sufficient, I think if you have a client, a survivor of domestic violence, and at the time when she should have been filing or paying her taxes, she was focused on being safe, and maybe transient, maybe in a shelter, maybe all kinds of different things, I think that would be a great argument for a waiver of the penalties due to reasonable cause. And so this is something that an LITC could help the client obtain this waiver, and so that is something that we are able to do. Next slide. So first off, just a little bit of a primer. If somebody actually can't pay their taxes, or they can't pay all of their taxes, again, the image, and I have so many clients who think that they're going to be sent off basically to debtor's prison, or the IRS is going to gouge into their bank accounts or seize their home, their primary home. Certainly for the lower income levels, that is not likely, and even for some higher income levels. There are some alternatives to the IRS just taking however much they can take, and they are listed here on the slide: the currently not collectible, installment agreements, and offers in compromise. So currently not collectible is actually an income-based situation where we establish to the IRS that the person actually just cannot afford to pay anything right now, and so the IRS just holds off and says, okay, you can't afford it right now. If you start making money later, that's different, but for now, we are not going to try and collect from you. Installment agreements are best when somebody actually has some money each month. They actually could make payments, but they can't pay it all at once, and that is something that can be negotiated with the IRS and set up. The final one is offer in compromise. This is when the IRS is not going to be able to actually collect everything that the person owes because of the person's income. And so they will then sometimes accept something less than the full amount due. So these can be as low as $20 or $100, depending on the client and the situation. These are also the subject of those late night TV commercials. They settle your debt for pennies on the dollar. There are some complications with the offer and compromise program. It can take a period of time to get an offer through. Many people will not qualify for it because, in fact, under the IRS's assessment of their income level, They actually do have enough money left over each month in order to pay off the full amount during the time period that the IRS has to collect the full amount, in which case they will not accept something less than. And it's a bit of an issue. Some of those late-night TV commercial places can advertise for this. They will take in people who actually are not going to qualify for the Offer and Compromise program. They're going to charge them $3,000 or $6,000 in order to do the program, even though the person is not actually going to qualify for it. And that is an issue because, of course, it's basically a scam. So if you know somebody and they think that an Offer and Compromise might be appropriate, then the best choice really would be to contact a low-income taxpayer clinic, and we can help do that Offer and Compromise for somebody for no fee whatsoever. And we will give an honest assessment of whether or not they're going to qualify for it at all. So next slide. All right, so for married people, generally speaking, if you have filed a married filing jointly tax return, that means that there is what we call joint and several liability for the full amount due under that return. So joint and several liability means that each person on that return is 100% responsible for any liability on the return. And that does not matter who earned the income, who may have created those circumstances for any deductions, none of that. So each person, so if there's $32, there's $32 owed on the return, then both husband and spouse would owe $32, and the IRS will come after both people until that liability is satisfied by one or the other of them. All right, now, so first off, though, there is a difference. That is there I'm talking about a valid married filing jointly tax return. If there was a forged signature without consent, then of course that's not a valid return. This is identity theft. Likewise, if the survivor signed under duress, the return is not valid. However, that duress is not necessarily just kind of generalized to stress or pressure or control, but it's really an immediate demand in the moment with significant pressure, so that the person is absolutely unable to resist the demands and the person would not have signed the return but for the pressure from the other person. So it's a very narrow and episodic specific event. But if so, then there is no married filing jointly return, and we're not really in the bucket of the things that we're talking about later. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when there is this valid married filing jointly return, there are, however, times when it is appropriate, and Congress has authorized in the code exceptions for that married filing jointly that joint several liability responsibility. So one of those we call injured spouse, and the other is called innocent spouse. So next slide, I'm going to start with injured spouse. And this is essentially when somebody has an individual debt from before the year where they filed the married filing jointly return. So maybe they have back child support due, or federal student loan debt, or their own individual tax debts. And what happens is that there would be a refund coming off of that return normally, but instead it is taken to pay off that person's back individual tax debt. So say you have a husband and a wife. The wife is the only one earning income, and the husband, however, has back child support due. So the refund from that wife's income, from the W-2 that she got, and the withholding that she had at her employer, that refund is going to pay off his back child support. So this is a fairly easy thing to fix. You can file this special form, the 8379, so that it is allocated, and she actually gets to keep the refund attributable to her income. And if there was a part of the refund that would be attributable to his income, it would still go to pay off the back child support. But the part from hers is protected. Now here you have to be aware that there is a special statute of limitations for refund claims, which is 3 years from when a return is filed, or 2 years from the time a tax is paid if later. So you may not be able to get that money back forever. You won't be able to, but if you do it within these time frames, then you should be okay. So next slide. I'm going to get a little bit more into, but still be very surface treatment on innocent spouse. So innocent spouse is kind of a separate category, and this is when basically for kind of justice purposes, it is anticipated in the Internal Revenue Code that there are reasons why that joint several liability might not be fair. So there are three main categories of that. The first one is when the return understated the amount due. So the return, the IRS has determined that actually more tax is due than what is showing on the return. But the survivor had no knowledge or reason to know about the erroneous items. So for example, the other spouse had some side income and didn't tell her about it. She didn't have any reason to know about it. And so it wouldn't be fair to hold her responsible. So for example, in our clinic we had a case where the spouse had a side job. She had no knowledge of it, and in fact he was using the money to support his new girlfriend who lives an hour away, and so it really isn't fair to hold her responsible for the tax consequences of this side income. So next slide. Another one is when you have a joint tax return that, again, understates the amount of tax due, but she had no actual knowledge, and the parties haven't been living together for at least a year. In this circumstance, they aren't going to make any refunds to fix things, but they will at least allocate the liability for the deficiency in approximately the same manner as if the spouses had filed separately. Next slide. The final one is basically an equitable relief provision. So this could be an understatement of tax, or the tax return could have actually been correct, and but the amount of the liability wasn't paid. But for some reason, it isn't fair to hold her responsible. So there are a bunch of factors possible here. It's a non-exclusive list, but you can notice that domestic violence is one of the factors, as well as economic hardship, mental physical health, the benefit that the survivor got from the tax not being paid or being understated, and of course her knowledge or reason to know of the item or that the liability would not be paid. So this is facts and circumstances situation, and the IRS or the judge, tax court judge, is going to look at that and decide whether it would be in fact equitable to hold her responsible for the full amount of the tax due or not. Next slide. So for the first of those two kinds of innocent spouse relief, the survivor must file for that within the first 2 years of collection activity against her. So that could include the first collection activity is a defined term. It includes an offset of her income tax refund, the filing of a claim by the IRS in a court proceeding, or the issuance of a notice of intent to levy. For the third kind, there is no particular statute of limitations on that. Now, again, just as a safety issue, the other spouse is going to be notified of her claim and have a right to intervene in the case. So they can say, oh, no, you should not let the survivor out of this liability. In a tax court case, either person, so your client can file a motion for a protective order to keep at least her address from the other spouse, so for some privacy there. Now, recently they have actually, when they're making decisions about innocent spouse cases, they have been calling her or calling the attorney and letting them know, okay, we've made this decision, it's favorable for your client, we're sending the letter to the ex-spouse, or the current spouse, whatever, the batterer, and letting him know, so that there's a little bit of warning time for her to take whatever safety precautions are appropriate. Now, the final thing on here is assistance. The innocent spouse relief can be difficult to do, so by all means, this would be a great opportunity for people to draw on the resources of the low-income taxpayer clinics so that they can have the best shot at that as possible. Next slide. So there are some resources that are listed here on this slide for mostly websites and telephone numbers for filing requirements, filing status, and tax credits, to find a VITA site, which is, again, the free tax assistance site, for various flyers and outreach materials that may be helpful to you or your clients. And of course, if you want more additional information, there's contact information here for the Oregon Coalition. Next slide. And then I think this is my final slide, just to let you know there are 3 low-income taxpayer clinics in Oregon, which is fabulous, and they can help with all the kinds of things that I've been talking about, and by all means, you or your clients should be taking advantage of their services. There is also a Taxpayer Advocate Service office in Oregon, and you can find them by calling these numbers, and we can pay attention. The low-income filers may qualify for your low-cost legal services through the OregonLawHelp.org website or the lawyer referral service from the state bar, and there's a telephone number there. And then I think I turn this over to somebody else for the final slide, right?
Yeah, this is Keri with the coalition. So, so the final slide is the EITC coalitions in Oregon. There's one in Medford and one in Eugene, so you can reach out to them those ways. And then I wanted to answer real quick an earlier question. One of the presenters in the beginning was talking about address confidentiality programs. I did want to clarify that Oregon does have an address confidentiality program, and so if you need more information, you can reach out to me at the coalition, and we can get more information to you. I think at this point, I am turning it over to Amy if there's any questions.
Sure. Susanna, did any questions come in over the course of the webinar?
We did just have a couple. One for Amy. Can you explain the difference between the child tax credit and the child dependent care credit? Just quickly, one more time.
Sure. So the federal child tax credit is a tax credit you get just for having children. You don't have to submit any expenses. You just have to have a dependent child that meets the age and relationship and residency tests that we briefly outlined, whereas a child and dependent care tax credit is based on the expenses that you pay to care for children or disabled dependents so that you can go to work or look for work. So for this one, you have to claim certain amounts of expenses, and then you'll get a percentage of them back as a tax credit. Another difference between the child tax credit and the child and dependent care tax credit is that the federal child tax credit is refundable, while only the Oregon Working Family Tax Credit, which is one of the child and dependent care tax credits, is refundable. Thanks, Susanna.
All right, and we have approached 2 o'clock, and I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. So I want to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. I think this was a very helpful webinar. And if you have any other questions, feel free to contact us or any of the presenters. Their emails are on the PowerPoint, which we will get to you in the next day or so. So thank you all, and have a great afternoon.